And so today, the book I wanted to recommend and talk about today is The Siren's Call by Chris Hayes. The subtitle is How Attention Became the World's Most Endangered Resource. Now, if you don't know who Chris Hayes is, he is a political commentator on MS Now, which used to be called MSNBC, but it got spun off. He's one of the commentators that I really enjoy listening to. He is quite well read, quite knowledgeable about politics, and is really good at being very succinct at making his point, something that I would like to always do better at. I think he was a philosophy major actually in school, so you can kind of tell when he talks. And therefore, this book was interesting because it's not about politics. He brings it up from time to time, but it's much more fundamental and much more spiritual. In it, Hayes argues that we are in the midst of a transition whose only parallel is that of labor in the 19th century. Attention has become a commodified resource extracted from us and from which we are increasingly alienated. So he starts with one of the oldest metaphors in human storytelling that appears in Homer's Odyssey, of all places. Many of you probably remember it from high school Greek mythology class you had to take, and maybe you don't know about it. So the story is Odysseus. So Odysseus, this is part of Homer's trilogy of the Iliad, the Aeneid, and the Odyssey. And the Odyssey is after the Trojan War, and Odysseus is trying to get home, and it takes him an entire decade to get there, and you go through all these adventures, and he has to learn a lot. Well, one of those is he has to pass the island of the Sirens. Now, these are creatures, I always imagined them as some mermaid-like creature who had this irresistible song that lures sailors to the destruction on the rocky coast and the shallow waters near this island. And so shipwreck after shipwreck, I can just imagine that there's just hundreds and hundreds of shipwrecks all around it. And the sailors know about it, but they can't resist. So Odysseus knows this, but he cannot trust his own willpower to take care of it. So he does something really wise and humble. He makes the whole crew fill their ears with wax, so they're temporarily deaf. And so I'm imagining you can't hear anything unless they're right up in your ear screaming at you, and then maybe you communicated through body movements instead. But the whole crew is temporarily deaf so that they can't be tempted by the siren's song. Now, then he orders the crew to bind him to the mast of a ship, but he doesn't have any wax in his ears. And he instructs them that they absolutely cannot release him no matter what he does, how much he screams, how much in agony he looks like he is, until they reach a point past the island where it's safe and you can no longer hear the siren sing. He wants to hear the song, but he doesn't want to be destroyed by it. Well, in the book, The Siren's Call, Chris Hayes argues that this ancient myth has become an uncanny, accurate description for our modern lives. Every day we sail through waters filled with sirens. Our information technology has morphed into these mythological beings. They sing through our phones, through notifications, through algorithmic feeds designed to grab us again and again and again. And Hayes argues that what these systems seek to capture is not really our time. They seek our attention. And attention, he says, is the most precious resource we possess. He tells this story, and it seems so logical that when babies are born, they're completely dependent on everybody around them for everything that they need. And they can't do anything for themselves except one thing: get the attention of the people around them by crying, by screaming, right? And so we enter this world with attention being one of our most important talents that we have. both getting attention, asking for attention, and then giving attention. So it's one of the most precious resources we possess. But then he says this. He says, in this information age that we live in, ironically, information is abundant and attention is scarce. We live in an age overflowing with information. There's more news, more images, opinions, and videos than any human mind could ever hope to process in a lifetime. However, we 21st century humans probably have the same attention capacity our species has always probably had, and it remains limited. Think about it this way. We each only get one consciousness. We only each get one life. We only get one stream of awareness in that life. So therefore, what we attend to becomes our life. Or as the author of the reading I read before, he said, we are in danger of slowly losing the thread of our own life. Hayes is much more blunt. He says, if attention is the substance of life, then the question of what we pay attention to is the question of what our lives will be. I'm going to read that one again. If attention is the substance of life, then the question of what we pay attention to is the question of what our lives will be. If you think about it, that sentence could have easily come from a spiritual teacher anywhere, not a political commentator. That's why I found the book so fascinating. If you think about it, every spiritual tradition has understood this, and therefore stresses spiritual practices focused on key themes and values to that discipline. Just the most famous examples in our culture, Buddhist meditation is about training attention. It's about mindfulness. That's the one that's the most direct to what this is talking about. But Jewish prayer, it's always directing attention towards the sacred. When I was in seminary and doing my chaplaincy, one of my fellow ministers was a Orthodox rabbi, Hasidic Jew, and so he explained that everything he did, the way he buttoned his garment, how he dressed, everything he did was always supposed to draw his attention toward God. Christian contemplation is about resting attention on love, particularly if you believe that Jesus is love personified and you're always focused on what would Jesus do. Christian contemplation is resting attention on love. And Unitarian Universalism, which comes out of a Christian tradition, invites us to bring mindful attention to love-centered living through our shared values and the interdependence of it all. Basically, attention shapes our soul. So what Hayes adds to that then is a warning. He says, in our era, attention has become a commodity. Technology companies compete fiercely for it because whoever captures attention gains power and profit. We all know now that our devices are not neutral tools. Maybe they were when the smartphone came out in 2009, 2010, but they're not. They're engineered environments designed to interrupt us over and over and over again. Hayes describes how modern media doesn't try to hold our attention steadily. It works by repeatedly grabbing it. And he talks about his own frustration. He gives the example of Walter Cronkite back in the day when everybody watched the news together at dinner time. And there was just someone like Walter Cronkite on CBS who was the anchor, and he would say, welcome, and he would read the stories for the day, and our attention were wrapped in the words that he was talking about, and he was just very grandfatherly and would just kind of talk about it. And that's pretty much what happened, right? He says now he has a similar job. He said, I prepare what I'm going to tell you and how I want to deliver the news, and it will be my wish to be like Walter Cronkite, where you would just sit and listen to what I have to say. But he said that our society doesn't work that way. When I'm on screen, I know very well that there's a headline going across the bottom of the screen in it's red, white lettering with a red background. And up on top, there's something that's constantly changing about who's talking and what's an update. And there's usually a picture next to him that's constantly changing and often is a video. So he says, I'm left to compete with the screen that I'm talking from. And the whole reason is because I'm judged by how much attention I can keep. And so I have to keep grabbing it. He says it's very, very, very frustrating. I mean, think about our design on what we use, our phone, right? You're scrolling, scroll, scroll, scroll. Then you get a notification. Then there's a ping if you've got your sound on, or there's an alert. And then you watch the next little video on Instagram, and then you see the next outrage, and then the next crisis. Each one is really small. Each one is really brief, but together, endlessly, they scatter the mind. And when attention becomes fragmented, something deeper begins to erode. There's a lot of press on this. Our capacity for reflection erodes. Our capacity for empathy erodes because we're overwhelmed. Our capacity for community, other than online, erodes. I'm sure this sounds or feels familiar to all of us. This is what some politicians want to happen so that they can gain more power because we're distracted. Hayes reminds us that the human mind has always struggled with distraction. He quotes a 17th century philosopher, Blaise Pascal, who wrote, "All the unhappiness of men arises from one single fact, that they cannot stay quietly in their own chamber." That line feels almost prophetic today. Because the sirens are no longer outside us. They live in our pockets, for God's sakes, and they call to us every few minutes. But Hayes also insists something important. This is not about our personal weakness. He reminds us the systems surrounding us are designed specifically to capture our attention, because attention is now an economic resource. Just as the Industrial Revolution commodified labor, so if you're not familiar with that, before the Industrial Revolution, everyone worked in their own craft shops or in their own farms, and they were doing whatever they needed to get done for work from start to finish, typically and often in community. And then in the Industrial Revolution, people came to the cities because they needed work. And they were selling the labor that they could produce, and often it was doing the exact same thing over and over and over again, treating the human body like a machine, so that labor became a commodity. And he said that, like the Industrial Revolution commodified labor, the digital age commodifies consciousness. Our awareness becomes something that can be measured, sold, and extracted. It sounds creepy, doesn't it? One reviewer summarized Hayes' argument this way: attention is not merely a commodity, it is the medium of our consciousness itself. In other words, when our attention is captured, something deeper than productivity is at stake. Our very experience as human beings is at stake. Now, this is where Hayes' argument becomes very, very spiritual. Because the question is not simply, how do we manage our phones? That's not what I was going to tell you today. I think you've all tried to do that. The question is, back up a minute, put your phone away and think about this. What deserves our attention? Or who deserves our attention? Or what kind of world deserves our attention? Hayes writes that modern systems compete for attention because dramatic claims grab us more easily than quiet truth. We all know this. His quote is, a big lie is often more attentionally compelling than a list of small truths. Isn't that sad? He says, outrage spreads faster than compassion. Fear spreads faster than wisdom. Spectacle spreads faster than truth, which means that what captures our attention is not necessarily what deserves it. And then this is where spiritual practice becomes a form of resistance. Meditation becomes resistance. Simple silence becomes resistance. Deep listening to someone else becomes resistance. Community like ours becomes resistance. Because each of these practices reclaims attention from the sirens. And then Hayes returns to the Odysseus story again to describe how we might respond. Odysseus didn't simply trust his willpower. He prepared in advance. He made commitments before hearing the song. He bound himself to the mast. So he suggests we do the same. We must decide before the sirens sing, before our phones ring again, what matters most. Our children, our communities, our democracy, our spiritual lives. Because if we do not choose what we attend to, something else will choose for us. And so the spiritual challenge of our time may be this: to treat attention as sacred, to guard it the way previous generations guarded Sabbath time, to create spaces where attention can deepen rather than scatter, where conversation is longer than a tweet, where silence is not feared, where we can sit quietly in our own chambers, and where we can look at one another not as content, not as competitors for attention, but as fellow human beings. He reminds us attention ultimately exists for something deeper, for care, for reciprocity, for relationship. Which brings us back to Odysseus. He didn't bind himself to the mast simply to survive the sirens. He did it because he had somewhere he wanted to go, and that place was home. And that may be the deepest question Hayes then asks us. Where is home for our attention? Is it in endless scrolling, or is it in love? Is it in justice? Is it in the work of repairing the world? In the quiet miracle of paying full attention to another human being? So if attention truly is the substance of life, then every moment of attention becomes a moral act. Every moment becomes a choice about what kind of life and what kind of world we are helping to create. So I'll close with these words. May we learn the wisdom of Odysseus. May we know the power of the sirens. And may we bind ourselves with intention and community to the things that truly matter. And may we sail together towards a world worthy of our attention. Amen.